Before anyone marked the date, before maps were redrawn or flags reconsidered, the city breathed in its ordinary rhythm. Morning arrived without ceremony. Bakers lifted shutters that had been lifted for years. Milk bottles clinked softly on stone steps. Somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle released its thin cry into the pale air, and hundreds of feet adjusted their pace without thinking. The streets did not rush, they flowed. Market vendors called out prices with voices trained by repetition. Their tones carried familiarity rather than urgency. Neighbors recognized one another by the pattern of steps along cobblestones. Some could tell who was approaching without looking up from a newspaper. A certain heel struck harder than the rest. A certain stride dragged slightly at the end of the day. Inside narrow shops, customers were known by voice alone. A cough at the doorway, a quiet greeting, and the shopkeeper was already reaching for the correct jar or cut of meat. No forms were signed. No identification requested. Trust functioned quietly, like plumbing beneath the street. Rarely noticed, always relied upon. Children measured time differently, not by clocks, but by sound. Church bells gave structure to their games. The afternoon shift at the factory signaled when to begin walking home. Radios hummed through open windows in the evening, carrying music, weather, and small stories that felt larger than they were. No one leaned too close to listen. The signal was steady. It always had been. Nothing in the air hinted at fragility. That is what made it convincing. Stability does not announce itself. It settles so deeply that it feels permanent. Conversations stayed local. Arguments remained small. Even rumors, when they appeared, floated past like stray leaves. A train arrived 10 minutes late. Someone mentioned a broadcast that cut off too quickly. A traveller spoke of movement at the border. These details drifted through cafes and disappeared beneath more immediate concerns. Rent, weather, repairs. People made plans without hesitation. Weddings were scheduled. Inventory ordered months ahead. Parents argued about schooling as if the future were guaranteed to follow its usual path. There was no countdown, no tightening in the chest, no collective pause, just an ordinary morning unfolding into afternoon. And yet, later they would remember this stretch of days with unusual clarity. The way the sunlight fell across certain windows, the exact tone of the whistle, the weight of a newspaper held casually, without suspicion. Nothing warned them, no sirens, no countdown, just the steady pulse of routine carrying them forward. As the city settled into another predictable evening, lamps flickering on one by one, it could not sense that history was already close enough to be heard, if anyone had been listening differently. The first change was not something people saw, it was something they did not hear. Morning arrived again, pale and steady, yet the city did not sound like itself. The factory whistle did not rise from the east. The tramline, usually rattling before sunrise, remained still. Radios clicked on across kitchens and small bedrooms. But instead of music or weather reports, there was only a thin layer of static, like breath trapped between stations. At first, no one panicked. Devices failed sometimes. Schedules drifted. Silence could still be explained. Doors opened cautiously. Footsteps gathered along the streets, slower than usual. Conversations began in low tones, and then thinned, as if people sensed an interruption that had not yet been named. Curtains shifted. Windows opened halfway and closed again. The air felt pressed, waiting for something to move through it. Then it did. The soldiers did not run. They did not shout. Columns advanced with calm certainty, boots striking the pavement in unified rhythm. Not hurried, not aggressive. Simply present, their uniforms were clean, their formation exact, their expressions unreadable. They moved as if they had rehearsed these streets long before stepping onto them. No barricades were stormed, no fires burned. Instead, signs appeared where shop advertisements had hung the night before. Words written in unfamiliar script were nailed into place with efficient hands. A municipal building that had belonged to no single person now belonged to someone else entirely. Guards stood outside its doors by mid-morning. Not many, just enough. People watched from doorways. Some pretended not to watch at all. What unsettled them was not noise but composure. Nothing announced control, it unfolded. Authority shifted quietly, as if a contract had expired, and another had already taken effect. Clerks were replaced. Offices reorganized. Instructions handed out with little explanation. The speed was not frantic. It was practiced. Rumors tried to form, but there was no space for speculation. The presence spoke for itself. Radios continued their empty hiss. The tramline did not restart. Even the birds seemed to avoid the main square, circling once before settling elsewhere. Fear did not erupt, it settled. The city understood something without being told. No declaration was read aloud. No dramatic occupation speech filled the streets. Yet by afternoon, everyone sensed that the ground beneath them had shifted in ownership. They did not announce control, they behaved as if it had always been theirs. By evening, the silence no longer felt temporary, it had weight, and as people returned indoors, glancing once more at the corners where uniforms now stood motionless, they began to understand that adjustment would not be optional. No pamphlet appeared, no broadcast clarified expectations. There was no list posted at the square explaining how to behave in the new reality. And yet, within days, the city began to move differently. People learned by watching. A certain street, busy just a week earlier, now emptied whenever a patrol turned the corner. A doorway that once hosted loud debate grew quiet after one man was questioned too long outside it. The lesson did not need repeating. It settled into memory faster than any announcement could have. Walking changed first. Strides shortened. Movements became efficient, purposeful. Loitering disappeared. People kept to the edges of the pavement rather than the center. They stopped mid-conversation when boots approached, then resumed with altered topics once the echo faded. Eyes lowered not in submission, but in calculation. Shopping felt different. Customers spoke in shorter sentences. Shopkeepers measured responses carefully. Questions that once drifted freely across counters, about news, about neighbors, about the late train, were replaced with safe remarks about weather or bread. Language compressed. Humor, once sharp and public, softened into private gestures. Sarcasm vanished entirely, it depended too much on risk. No one announced which topics were forbidden. No one needed to. A glance was enough. A pause signaled boundaries. Conversations ended abruptly, not because anyone demanded silence, but because silence was wiser. The city absorbed patterns quickly. Certain buildings were no longer entered without reason. Certain names were no longer spoken without caution. Even children sensed it. Their games shifted away from central squares. Their laughter lowered without instruction. They watched their parents watching the streets and copied the posture instinctively. The remarkable thing was not obedience. It was speed. Within days, instincts recalibrated. What had once felt natural eye contact, argument, open curiosity, now felt exposed. Safety lay in anticipation, in predicting where tension might form and stepping aside before it did. Fear, when it first arrived, had hovered in the air like smoke. Now it settled into muscle and speech. It did not shout, it adjusted. The occupation no longer needed to demonstrate power daily. People carried its presence inside their choices. No one explained the rules. But everyone followed them. By the end of that first week, the city no longer waited for instructions. It moved as if it had always known the shape of restriction. And as public behavior grew polished in its caution, another shift began quietly. One that would reach beyond streets and marketplaces, crossing thresholds into living rooms and kitchens, where silence would learn to live even closer to the heart. The change did not stop at the threshold. Houses that had once felt separate from the street now seemed connected to it by unseen threads. Windows were closed even when the air grew heavy. Curtains stayed drawn longer into the morning. The simple act of leaving them open began to feel like an invitation, though no one could explain to whom. Inside kitchens and narrow living rooms, conversations no longer stretched across the table. They arrived in fragments. Sentences began and ended without completion. Certain topics dissolved mid-thought, replaced by safer ones. Even when no footsteps echoed outside, people lowered their voices instinctively, as if sound itself might travel farther than it used to. Radios, once a source of steady comfort, became tools of camouflage. They played softly in the background during difficult discussions, filling the room with harmless noise. Not loud enough to draw attention, just enough to blur what might otherwise be heard too clearly. Children noticed the difference. They were told gently, then firmly, not to repeat what they heard at home. Questions were answered carefully, sometimes not at all. Neighbors stopped knocking unannounced. Visits were arranged in advance, or avoided entirely. When someone lingered too long in the hallway, conversation inside would pause until the silence outside confirmed departure. Trust reshaped itself quietly. Walls, once assumed solid, now felt porous. Words carried weight they had never carried before. Even alone, people rehearsed what they would say and what they would not. Private opinions remained unspoken simply because speaking them felt unnecessary. The occupation's presence, so visible in uniforms and altered buildings, now lived inside memory and anticipation. It required no patrol to enforce itself within these rooms. Fear had become a habit, not frantic, steady. At night, when lamps dimmed and families settled into uneasy rest, the city sounded different from before. The absence of casual laughter, the shortening of evening arguments, the way footsteps moved lightly across wooden floors. Nothing outwardly violent had occurred, yet something intimate had shifted beyond repair. The safest place in the city no longer felt safe. There was no confrontation to mark the end of this first stage, no decision to resist, just adaptation layered upon adaptation. The city endured, not by challenging what had arrived, but by narrowing itself carefully, and as silence settled fully into the home, it prepared to accompany daily life in ways that would stretch far beyond that first uncertain week. In time, the city resumed its visible routines. Market stalls returned to their places beneath faded awnings. Trams, after days of silence, began to rattle along their tracks again. Factory doors reopened. People stepped back into schedules that resembled the ones they had known before. From a distance, little appeared altered. Up close, everything had changed. Movement slowed without instruction. Shoppers paused at intersections, not because traffic demanded it, but because awareness had become constant. Before speaking, people measured their surroundings. A glance over the shoulder, a subtle shift in tone, a sentence shortened midway. These adjustments were so slight they barely registered, yet they accumulated into a new choreography. Uniforms blended into the backdrop like lampposts or statues. Soldiers did not always intervene, they stood. They observed their stillness carried its own instruction. The city learned that enforcement did not need to be frequent to be effective. Visibility alone reshaped posture. Conversations remained polite, efficient, unfinished. Laughter, once careless, grew selective. Public celebrations diminished without being officially cancelled. Music still played in Café C's, but softer. Toasts were raised with restraint. Joy became private, not because it was outlawed, but because it felt exposed. Happiness that drew attention felt like risk. Workplaces functioned with quiet efficiency. Clerks stamped documents. Mechanics repaired engines. Teachers resumed lessons. Yet a shared ease was missing. Colleagues spoke in lowered tones even when alone. Breaks grew shorter. Eyes wandered toward windows instinctively, as if expecting oversight even when none was visible. The remarkable aspect was not the presence of force, but the absence of friction. No daily demonstrations were required. No dramatic punishments paraded through the square. Compliance emerged gradually from uncertainty. When consequences cannot be predicted, caution becomes rational. People adjusted body language without conscious thought. Shoulders stayed slightly squared. Hands remained visible. Gestures softened. Even disagreement adopted a neutral face. It was not submission in the traditional sense. It was calculation. The city still functioned, but it no longer relaxed. Public life became a performance of normality. Shops opened on time. Newspapers circulated with approved headlines. Workers travelled predictable routes. Yet beneath this layer of order, tension remained constant, like a faint vibration beneath the pavement. What had once been automatic now required attention. The simple act of gathering in a group felt deliberate. The casual wandering of afternoon strolls grew rare. Efficiency replaced spontaneity. And as public spaces settled into this watchful stillness, another reality emerged quietly beneath it. Survival depended not only on movement and speech, but on access, on food, on wages, on permission. The streets had adapted. Now the question became whether livelihoods could do the same. Food returned to the markets, but not in the same way. Choice narrowed into allocation. Lines formed before sunrise, orderly and patient, each person holding a small card that determined what could be taken and what must be left behind. Flour measured by weight, sugar by the spoon, meat by availability rather than preference. Hunger was not immediate, but it hovered close enough to influence behavior. Work reorganized itself just as quietly. Notices appeared listing reassigned roles. Engineers were transferred to projects deemed essential. Clerks were shifted into offices that had once intimidated them. Some jobs vanished entirely. A musician might find himself repairing vehicles. A shop owner might be asked to keep inventory not for profit, but for distribution. Skill became leverage. Those whose trades proved useful enjoyed small privileges. Extra portions, stable hours, a measure of protection. Others felt themselves drift downward through no fault of their own. Status rearranged without announcement. The respected teacher stood in line beside the former apprentice, both dependent on stamped approval. Compliance acquired value. It purchased predictability. A worker who followed instructions precisely could expect steadier access than one who questioned assignments. Not safety, but consistency. In a landscape governed by uncertainty, consistency felt close to luxury. People negotiated privately with their conscience. A mechanic accepted a position maintaining vehicles he did not support. A baker supplied bread to offices he would rather avoid. These decisions were not declared. They were weighed at kitchen tables late at night, voices lowered, calculations quiet. Under occupation, survival is rarely neutral, judgment blurred. What once seemed clear, loyalty, pride, independence, now intersected with hunger, family, and obligation. Refusal carried consequences that extended beyond the individual. Compliance shielded more than one life. The city adjusted its values without admitting it had done so. Identity began to attach itself to usefulness rather than aspiration. A person became what kept them necessary. And necessity in turn shaped behavior more effectively than threats ever could. Yet even as material life found its new structure, something subtler tightened. Access to food and work could be measured and controlled. Thoughts could not, at least not directly, but language, memory, and expression would soon discover boundaries of their own. The change in language arrived more quietly than the change in food or labour. One afternoon, a poster vanished from a wall near the square. A week later, a display of books in a shop window thinned without explanation. Titles that had once rested openly in view were no longer reordered. No public decree announced the removals. Shelves simply adjusted. Newspapers still circulated, but their tone shifted. Certain names no longer appeared in print. Certain events were described without detail, as if clarity itself had become excessive. At first, people noticed the absences. Then they stopped remarking on them. Censorship did not present itself as a barrier. It settled like weather. Conversations adapted. Before speaking, minds rehearsed possible consequences. Words were weighed not for meaning alone, but for safety. An internal editor formed, swift and automatic. Sentences shortened before they reached the air. In classrooms, lessons continued with tidy precision. History was taught, but its edges were softened. Conflicts were simplified. Questions redirected. Teachers did not always agree with what they delivered, yet they delivered it steadily. Children absorbed timelines with missing segments, unaware that anything had been removed. When they asked about the gaps, answers were gentle and incomplete. At home, adults practiced selective storytelling. Memories once shared freely became private. A father might begin recounting an event from years past, then pause, altering the ending or omitting a name, not because he was ordered to, but because he sensed the risk of clarity. Over time, even he remembered the altered version more easily than the original. They didn't erase the past. They taught people how to forget it. Forgetting proved efficient. It reduced friction. It eased tension between present reality and former certainty. The more inconvenient memories faded, the smoother daily life became. Yet, something vital shifted alongside them. Memory, once personal, now felt strategic. Control over narrative reached deeper than patrols ever could. When people adjusted their recollections voluntarily, authority no longer needed to correct them. Silence moved from speech into thought. The city continued functioning, but its stories narrowed. Older generations recognized the loss most sharply, though they rarely spoke of it. Younger ones inherited a version of history that fit more neatly within current boundaries. Memory became the final contested space, not through confrontation, but through adaptation. And as recollection thinned, identity began to depend less on what had been lived, and more on what was permitted to endure. In time, a new kind of discipline took root in the city. It did not require courage, nor did it demand slogans. It required something quieter, the ability to pass through each day without leaving an imprint. Some people learned this instinctively. They dressed without distinction. They arrived at work on time and departed without lingering. They spoke when addressed and volunteered nothing extra. Their expressions settled into neutrality, not from emptiness, but from calculation. Attention, once a mark of personality or pride, became a liability. The safest way to exist was to almost disappear. This disappearance was not physical. The same faces moved through the markets and offices, but their presence softened. Opinions folded inward. Humor was reserved for rare, private moments. Public identity narrowed to function alone, worker, neighbor, parent. Nothing more. From a distance, such behavior could be mistaken for submission. Yet it was strategy. Under occupation, visibility invited uncertainty. Those who drew notice, through talent, argument, or passion, risked becoming examples. The invisible avoided becoming symbols. Heroism, in this environment, lost its shape. There were no banners raised at dawn, no speeches from balconies. Survival unfolded through predictability. Predictability protected families, preserved access, reduced scrutiny. It allowed a person to continue existing without challenge. Over months, the strategy refined itself. Even emotional reactions adjusted. Anger remained private. Excitement muted. Surprise controlled. Identity contracted to what could be safely maintained. And this contraction worked. The city endured. Shops stayed open. Children grew taller. Meals were cooked. The machinery of daily life remained intact precisely because so many chose not to disturb it. Yet invisibility carried its own cost. The longer one avoided being seen, the more natural it felt to remain unseen. Instincts reshaped themselves around caution. Ambition dimmed, not by force, but by habit. Dreams recalibrated to what would not attract attention. In the beginning, invisibility was temporary, a tool for surviving a phase. But as months stretched on, it began to feel permanent. A person who has learned to withdraw from notice may one day struggle to step forward again. The chapter does not end with rebellion, nor collapse. It ends with balance, steady, restrained, efficient. The city had adapted well enough to endure, but beneath the surface of obedience, something else quietly waited, patient, and almost undetectable, preparing to move in ways that would not resemble defiance, yet would not remain still forever. Resistance, when people imagine it, often arrives loud. It carries banners, raised voices, visible refusal. But in this city, there were no crowds gathering in the square, no slogans whispered at midnight. What emerged instead was quieter, almost forgettable. A train scheduled for dawn left 10 minutes late. No explanation followed. The delay could be blamed on routine maintenance or a misread clock. Yet it happened again the following week, and once more the week after that. Always small enough to excuse, never large enough to accuse. Inside a municipal office, a stack of forms waited to be processed. One document slipped into the wrong folder. Another required additional verification that did not strictly exist. A signature was requested twice when once would have sufficed. The paperwork remained orderly, precise, officially compliant. It simply failed to advance as quickly as expected. Instructions were followed with exactness but not with enthusiasm. A shipment arrived intact, yet sorted less efficiently than it might have been. Repairs were completed, though not ahead of schedule. No one disobeyed. Nothing broke openly. Still, progress slowed. They resisted by doing nothing that could be proven. What defined these actions was not boldness but invisibility. Each gesture, examined in isolation, seemed harmless. Taken together, they created a faint resistance that never solidified into conspiracy. There were no meetings to dismantle, no manifesto to confiscate, only individuals adjusting their effort by a fraction, aligning it just enough with survival to remain safe. The boundary between endurance and defiance blurred. A mechanic who tightened bolts precisely, but never with haste, could claim diligence. A clerk who double-checked files beyond necessity could claim thoroughness. Their caution concealed intent. The occupying force maintained authority over buildings, schedules, territory. But intention remained untaxed. Thought moved beneath surveillance like water beneath ice, unseen yet persistent. Emotionally, this quiet defiance did not feel heroic. It felt practical. It allowed people to preserve something private without endangering families or livelihoods. A person could return home at night knowing they had not fully surrendered, even if no one else would ever know. Power, it turned out, was strongest when it appeared unquestioned. Yet even unquestioned systems depend on cooperation that carries energy. When that energy is withdrawn, even slightly, something shifts. The city discovered that resistance need not reveal itself to exist. It could function inside routine, disguised as caution, patience, even obedience. And as these small, deniable interruptions multiplied, the structure above them began to sense movement it could not quite detect, prompting new efforts to identify what left no trace. No one could point to the exact moment the word began circulating. It was never printed, never confirmed. Yet it settled into the city as surely as the uniforms had. Informants, they were rarely identified and almost never proven. That was their strength. A neighbour who spoke too confidently. A co-worker who listened more than he contributed. A friend who asked one question too many. None of it amounted to evidence. Still, doubt spread faster than fact ever could. Conversations shortened. Groups that once lingered in doorways now dispersed sooner than necessary. A harmless joke might hang in the air a second too long before being softened, redirected. The fear was not of immediate punishment. It was of memory, of a remark recalled later, repeated in a different room, reshaped into something incriminating. The most dangerous uniform in the city was invisible. Rumours proved more efficient than arrests. One whispered suspicion could isolate an entire household. Invitations declined. Greetings stiffened. Children instructed not to visit certain apartments without explanation. No official decree enforced these shifts. They unfolded naturally, encouraged by uncertainty. Authority did not need to verify every loyalty. It merely needed the possibility of betrayal to feel plausible. When people began guarding their words among friends as carefully as they did in public squares, surveillance decentralized itself. Control migrated from street corners into dining rooms. Trust, once assumed, now required calculation. Even lifelong acquaintances became partial strangers. People revealed only fragments of themselves in each setting, adjusting depending on audience. A person might speak one way at work, another at home, and neither entirely reflected their true thoughts. Silence expanded, not because speech was forbidden, but because confidence collapsed. The city grew cautious not only of soldiers standing at intersections, but of glances exchanged across tables. This uncertainty accomplished what force alone could not. It thinned relationships quietly. It redirected resistance inward. Collective defiance, already subtle, became riskier when loyalty could not be guaranteed. Suspicion did not need to be accurate to be effective. Its presence altered behavior regardless of truth. In such an atmosphere, courage looked different. It became measured not by public gestures, but by the choice of what to reveal and to whom. As trust fractured, the city adjusted once more. Resistance did not disappear, but it retreated further into solitude. What remained of defiance would now depend less on shared conviction and more on individual thresholds. Private lines drawn quietly, where conscience decided what could still be preserved. When trust grew thin and gatherings faded, resistance stopped trying to be collective. It withdrew into smaller rooms, into solitary choices that left no audience behind. It became less about outcomes and more about preservation. A teacher standing before a class reached a paragraph in a textbook and paused. The words were correct, officially sanctioned, carefully revised. Yet she summarized instead of reading it aloud. She shifted the emphasis slightly, softening one claim, sharpening another. The students did not notice the adjustment. It altered no policy. Still, she walked home knowing she had preserved something invisible. A father telling a bedtime story replaced certain endings. Heroes retained their doubts. Villains remained complicated. He offered his child a version of courage that did not depend on obedience alone. The story would not overturn any decree, but it carried a quiet refusal to surrender imagination entirely. In a municipal office, an employee declined a promotion without explanation. The advancement came with privileges, but also proximity to decisions he could not support. Accepting would have been easier, more profitable. Refusing narrowed his path, yet he kept a boundary intact, one that no record would reflect. They didn't expect change. They expected to endure themselves. These gestures did not disrupt schedules or stall shipments. They changed nothing measurable. That was precisely their strength. Their purpose was not victory, but continuity of identity. A person who bends completely ceases to recognize his own shape. These small refusals acted like internal anchors, subtle enough to remain safe, firm enough to prevent erosion. The cost, however, was real. Careers stagnated quietly. Invitations stopped arriving. Opportunities faded. Those who protected private lines often paid with slowed advancement or quiet suspicion. They carried a slight distance from both authority and ambition. There was no illusion that such choices would dismantle the system. The emotional shift here was profound. Resistance shed the expectation of triumph. It became maintenance of self, a way to remain intact beneath visible compliance. In this landscape, survival required more than food or safety. It required self-recognition. Without these deliberate limits, identity would thin beyond recovery. Yet the occupying power, patient and attentive, did not overlook these currents forever. As resistance refined itself inwardly, authority adjusted in response, not with louder force, but with subtler influence, pressing deeper into the territory of thought and perception itself. Not everyone who suffered consequences had done anything wrong. Often, what drew attention was not defiance, but distinction. A shopkeeper known for speaking boldly noticed customers thinning. A student whose essays carried unusual clarity found herself called into extra meetings. A worker praised for efficiency was reassigned to tasks that required less visibility. None were accused, none formally charged. Yet something had shifted around them. They had been noticed. In a watched city, being remarkable was the fastest way to vanish. Punishment did not always arrive as arrest or interrogation. Sometimes it came as scrutiny, a longer glance, a file updated quietly, a delayed approval. Attention itself became a warning. It signaled proximity to risk. Over time, the message settled deeply. Difference attracts inquiry. Inquiry invites uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a system that values predictability, is unwelcome. Talent began to dim intentionally. The gifted spoke less frequently. Artists simplified their work. Ambitious employees aimed for competence rather than excellence. Passion, once admired, felt hazardous. It suggested strong conviction, and conviction was difficult to categorize. This was the chapter's quiet twist. Resistance, to remain safe, learned to mirror obedience so closely that it became nearly indistinguishable. The teacher who altered a lesson did so with measured calm. The clerk who slowed paperwork appeared meticulous, not oppositional. Defiance survived by blending in perfectly. Visibility had once been a form of identity. Now it became liability. The city did not demand mediocrity outright, but it rewarded those who avoided edges. People shaped themselves accordingly, sanding down traits that might shine too brightly. The result was an exhaustion that settled without drama. It was tiring to monitor tone, to soften talent, to shrink enthusiasm. Maintaining invisibility required constant awareness. Even private resistance demanded discretion. The city adapted again, refining its instinct for survival. But something else thinned in the process. When distinction fades long enough, the desire to stand out can fade with it. What begins as strategy may harden into habit. By the end of this stage, the occupation's influence extended beyond streets, beyond memory, beyond speech. It had begun reshaping ambition itself. And as resistance grew increasingly concealed, almost indistinguishable from compliance, the focus shifted naturally toward the system that made such concealment necessary. An apparatus that did not rely on constant force, but on quieter methods, far more durable than noise. At first, control had been visible. Boots on pavement, uniforms at doors, new signs nailed into old walls. But as months passed, something subtler emerged. The patrols grew less frequent. Soldiers still appeared, yet no longer at every corner. Orders continued to circulate, but not with the urgency of those early days. And still, compliance deepened. It was no longer necessary to remind the city who governed it. The memory of enforcement did the work on its own. Bureaucracy became the dominant language of power. Movement required permits. Employment required authorization. Travel required signatures stacked upon signatures. None of these demands arrived with raised voices. They appeared on paper, stamped, folded, filed. A person could be stopped not by force, but by a missing document. Forms replaced confrontation. Queues replaced patrols. Waiting replaced warning. People began to anticipate restrictions before encountering them. A woman delayed visiting a relative because she assumed approval would be denied. A worker declined an opportunity that would require too many permissions. Decisions were made in advance of refusal. The system did not need to say no. People learned to assume it might. They no longer needed to watch everyone. Everyone was already watching themselves. This was the architecture of mature control. Enforcement became occasional, almost symbolic. Most days passed without incident, because most people had internalized the edges of what was allowed. The city regulated itself in pursuit of predictability. Offices filled with clerks whose authority existed entirely through stamps and ink. A single red mark could reroute a life for weeks. No shouting required. No visible dominance. Paper moved more powerfully than presence ever could. The unsettling realization was not that the occupying force remained strong. It was that it had become efficient. Power flowed through expectation rather than spectacle. Fear, once external, had settled into routine. A person waking each morning did not ask what was forbidden. He asked what was permitted. The shift was subtle but profound. When boundaries are anticipated rather than tested, resistance loses opportunity to surface. The city's obedience no longer required constant demonstration. It existed as assumption. Streets functioned. Markets opened. Work progressed. All of it within invisible lines drawn so long ago that they now felt natural. Yet even the most refined systems require oversight. While bureaucracy governed movement and opportunity, another layer worked quietly beneath it. One concerned not with papers or permits, but with thoughts, loyalties, and memory itself. By the time patrols grew quieter and bureaucracy settled into habit, another presence had already woven itself into the city. It was rarely seen directly. No dramatic raids marked its arrival. No headlines announced its reach. Yet its influence extended further than any uniform in the square. Files were opened slowly. Names entered on thin sheets of paper, dated and filed without urgency. A comment overheard at a workplace. A letter received from a distant cousin. A conversation remembered differently by two people. None of it urgent. None of it immediately punished. Just recorded. People spoke about the organization in lowered tones. They did not often name it, though everyone knew it existed. The KGB was less a visible force than a concept that shaped posture and speech. It did not need to appear. Its reputation performed the necessary work. They did not act quickly, they remembered. Surveillance here was not designed for spectacle, it was designed for patience. A file could sit untouched for years, gathering details like dust. When circumstances shifted, when a promotion was requested or permission sought, those details resurfaced. Pressure applied precisely where it would matter most. The genius of this system was its restraint. Arrest was not the primary goal, leverage was. Knowledge allowed influence without disruption. A whispered reminder that something was known often proved more effective than formal charges. The city adjusted accordingly. People behaved differently when they believed their words might outlive the moment. Conversations shortened further. Opinions softened. Associations were weighed carefully. The possibility of long memory discouraged short impulses. Waiting became a weapon. The absence of immediate consequence created an illusion of safety, while information accumulated quietly beneath it. Individuals moved through their days unaware of which moments were preserved and which were forgotten. In this atmosphere, even harmless remarks gained potential weight. Files matured like slow-growing roots beneath pavement. They did not announce themselves. They waited until needed. Power, in this form, did not rush. It extended across time. It did not aim to shock, it aimed to endure. And as surveillance settled into the background, less event than condition, the question shifted. If knowledge could be gathered so efficiently, how might truth itself be shaped? How could memory, already fragile, be directed with the same patience and precision? What begins as intrusion can, over time, become background. Markets operated on schedule. Offices processed documents. School bells rang at the same hour each morning. The uniforms that once startled pedestrians now blended into the cityscape, like statues placed long ago. No one flinched when they passed. Children stepped around them without curiosity. The occupation had not ended. It had settled. Families arranged their lives within the permitted boundaries so smoothly that the boundaries themselves began to disappear from view. The restrictions remained, but they no longer felt temporary. They felt structural, like walls that had always existed. Children born into this atmosphere accepted it without comparison. They knew the language of permits before they understood the language of choice. They memorized rules that older generations remembered learning reluctantly. To them, this was not adaptation. It was baseline. The danger was no longer fear, it was acceptance. Adults, too, experienced a subtle drift. The urgency that once accompanied each new directive softened. Where once they had counted days or whispered about eventual change, they now focused on schedules, birthdays, harvests. Survival ceased to feel provisional. It felt continuous. Memory thinned at the edges. Stories of life before occupation grew shorter, less detailed. Listeners heard them as distant anecdotes rather than lived experience. The past became something abstract, almost decorative. This was the system's quiet achievement. Control did not need to intensify. It needed only to endure long enough to feel ordinary. When restrictions are inherited rather than imposed, they rarely provoke resistance. No cruelty was required to maintain this state. No dramatic gesture reinforced it. Stability emerged not because the city approved, but because it adjusted. Homes remained standing. Wages were paid. Children grew. To an outside observer, it might appear that nothing was wrong at all. And that was the discomfort. The city had not collapsed under pressure. It had reorganized itself around it. What once felt temporary now seemed permanent. What once sparked inner protest now barely registered. Yet beneath this manufactured calm, something remained unspent. Acceptance can quiet opposition, but it cannot erase tension entirely. Like water held behind a dam, pressure does not vanish when it becomes invisible. It waits, gathering weight, unnoticed by those who have grown used to stillness. From the outside, the city looked balanced. Streets were swept, schedules kept, voices measured. The occupation had folded itself into routine so completely that visitors, if any had arrived, might have mistaken it for order rather than constraint. But silence, when stretched long enough, does not eliminate tension. It absorbs it. Doctors began noticing small shifts. Headaches that would not fade. Stomachs unsettled without clear cause. Sleeplessness that lingered even in homes where no immediate threat remained. None of these ailments pointed to a single event. They accumulated quietly, like dust in corners where no one thought to look. Tempers shortened over minor inconveniences. A queue that moved too slowly sparked irritation disproportionate to the delay. A misplaced document caused more frustration than it once would have. The surface remained controlled, but beneath it, patience thinned. Emotional distance grew harder to disguise. Conversations felt rehearsed. Reactions muted. Laughter arrived, but rarely lasted. People navigated each day competently, efficiently, yet with an undertone of strain. Nothing was happening. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The absence of visible conflict did not indicate harmony. It signaled compression. Years of adaptation, caution, and self-monitoring had layered upon one another. Each compromise, each silent adjustment, had been small. Together they formed a weight that found no natural release. The system relied on this calm. Its strength depended on predictability. As long as citizens moved within defined edges, control could remain light, almost invisible. But the human body and mind have limits. When energy cannot express itself outwardly, it redirects inward. It surfaces in restless nights, in glances that linger too long, in conversations that trail off without resolution. The city remained orderly. No protests filled the squares. No banners appeared overnight. The machinery of daily life continued to function. Yet beneath that steadiness, something unspoken gathered. Pressure does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It accumulates in places unseen, waiting for a fracture that may not resemble rebellion at all. Silence cannot expand indefinitely. Even the most disciplined calm carries a threshold. The chapter ends here, not with noise but with a sense of strain, an awareness that systems endure only as long as those within them can bear the quiet weight. And as that weight settles more heavily into ordinary lives, the first cracks will not appear through slogans or speeches, but through something far more fragile: human limitation. Sometime during the second winter, a quiet realization passed through the city. It did not arrive in conversation or decree. It settled privately, in kitchens and tram seats and office corridors. People stopped asking when it would end. In the beginning, the occupation had carried a sense of interruption, as though normal life were paused and waiting behind a curtain. Each month was measured against expectation. Each season change invited speculation. But as the calendar turned once more and the rules remained unchanged, something shifted. Spring returned under the same regulations. Summer markets opened with the same permits required. Autumn leaves fell beside the same uniformed figures, stationed at corners. Repetition dulled urgency. What had once felt temporary began to resemble climate. The adrenaline of those early days had long since burned away. Fear had been sharp, energizing even. It demanded attention. It kept people awake. Now it transformed into something heavier, a steady awareness without intensity. Constant vigilance proved exhausting, and exhaustion demanded relief. The hardest part was no longer being afraid. It was staying alert forever. People still complied. They still adjusted their words and movements. But the edge of constant awareness softened, not because danger disappeared, but because the body and mind could not sustain the same level of tension indefinitely. Survival shifted from active effort to automatic routine. Emotional tones flattened. Excitement felt muted. Disappointment lingered longer than joy. Plans were made, but without the same anticipation. Hope did not collapse dramatically. It thinned like fabric worn by repeated use. Time itself became part of the system. Days accumulated not as steps toward change, but as evidence of continuity. Waiting grew heavier than fear ever had. Fear at least implied immediacy. Waiting offered no such clarity. The city continued functioning. Work was completed. Families gathered at tables. Life moved forward in visible ways. Yet beneath it all lay a subtle fatigue, a weariness not easily named. People adapted to endurance the way they had once adapted to silence. It became familiar, manageable, almost comfortable. But as fear gave way to exhaustion, the strain did not disappear. It changed shape. And as this dull endurance settled into daily life, it began to reach further than schedules and streets, pressing gently into the spaces where relationships once carried warmth and conversation once carried energy. Food was rationed. Labor was assigned. Words were measured. Over time, something else began to thin, though no official system governed it: emotion. Kindness became irregular, like a resource that could no longer be spent freely. Patience shortened in kitchens and corridors. Small frustrations sparked arguments that once would have dissolved into laughter, not because people felt more intensely, but because they felt less able to absorb inconvenience. Constant restraint carries a cost. When every public gesture requires caution, private spaces do not always offer immediate relief. The effort of monitoring tone, posture, and thought throughout the day leaves little surplus for tenderness at night. Couples found themselves speaking more practically than before. Conversations revolved around tasks, schedules, rations. The unspoken weight between sentences grew heavier. Silence was no longer simply safety, it was fatigue. Parents, burdened by their own vigilance, disciplined quickly and without long explanation. Questions from children were answered with brevity. Curiosity, once encouraged, was redirected into safer paths. Children learned caution before confidence. They sensed boundaries even where none were explicitly drawn. No one taught them to become colder. It happened naturally. Emotional withdrawal did not signal cruelty. It signaled conservation. When life demands constant awareness, energy is rationed instinctively. Warmth becomes selective. Affection requires effort that sometimes feels unavailable. The city remained orderly. Streets functioned, schools operated, meals were prepared. From the outside, family life appeared intact. Yet within homes, something subtle shifted. Laughter visited less often. Disagreements lingered longer, apologies arrived, but without ease. The occupation reshaped more than behavior, it reshaped capacity. Connection itself became measured. People reserved feeling for essential moments, protecting it from unnecessary strain. Over months, this quiet scarcity altered relationships in ways no decree could capture. Love did not disappear. It compressed, like air in a sealed room. It waited for space to expand again. And as emotional life constricted, another adjustment began unfolding beneath it. With warmth in shorter supply, memory itself became selective. People learned not only how to guard their feelings, but how to choose which parts of the past deserved preservation and which were safer left unexamined. At first, memories were protected fiercely. Stories of the time before were told in careful tones, preserved like valuables hidden from view. Birthdays were measured against what life once felt like. Streets were described as they had been. Certain names were spoken softly, but with intention. Then something quieter began to happen. The stories grew shorter. It was not that recounting them was forbidden. In most homes, nothing prevented a father from recalling how the market once smelled at dawn, or how a train platform used to crowd with travellers heading farther than permits now allowed. The difficulty was internal. Remembering required energy, it stirred comparison. And comparison sharpened dissatisfaction. Remembering too much made survival harder. Dates blurred. Was it 2 years ago or 3 that the rules first changed? Did that festival take place the summer before, or the autumn after details softened at the edges? What once felt immediate receded into something distant and indistinct. People did not sit together and decide to forget. They simply stopped repeating certain stories. A memory unspoken fades differently than one suppressed. It loses texture, then urgency. Eventually, it becomes abstract, an idea rather than an experience. Personal history shortened. Individuals describe themselves less in terms of what had been and more in terms of what was currently allowed. The past felt heavier than necessary. It served little practical purpose in a world governed by adaptation. The imagination of the future narrowed alongside it. Plans extended to the next season, perhaps the next year, but rarely further. A long memory encourages long vision. Without one, expectation contracts. This was the revelation few recognized while it unfolded. Control no longer required external pressure when people managed their own recollections. Erasure proved most effective when it felt voluntary. Forgetting seemed like relief. It reduced friction between memory and present reality. The city learned to live with a shorter timeline. Yesterday mattered. Tomorrow mattered. Beyond that, distance grew. Identity, once anchored in shared history, drifted into immediacy. People became what they were now rather than what they had once hoped to be. And as memory thinned, something deeper than recollection began to shift. Meaning itself, once drawn from continuity and comparison, loosened its grip. What was left behind was not only a quieter past, but a quieter sense of purpose moving forward. Over time, contraction stopped feeling temporary. It became proportion. Ambitions, once expansive, adjusted quietly to fit within the edges of the permitted. A young man who once imagined studying abroad now focused on steady employment nearby. A woman who dreamed of opening her own shop settled into managing someone else's inventory. The dreams were not denounced. They simply felt impractical, like stories belonging to another climate. Life did not collapse, it narrowed. People began defining themselves by reliability rather than aspiration. To be dependable, punctual, discreet, these qualities rose above imagination and risk. Being known as predictable offered protection. Being known as ambitious invited uncertainty. They survived by becoming less than they once imagined. The contraction did not carry visible sorrow. It unfolded as sensible recalibration. Plans shrank to what could be achieved without disruption. Travel became local. Conversations became focused. Even hobbies adjusted, favoring quiet pursuits over public expression. Identity, once layered with possibility, flattened into function. A person was his occupation, her role within the family, his usefulness to a system already in place. This was not dramatic loss. It was practical reshaping. The unsettling part lay not in suffering, but in stability. Survival had succeeded. The city endured, families remained intact, routines continued. Yet something essential, something related to scale, had been traded away without ceremony. When imagination contracts long enough, it ceases to feel like contraction. It feels like realism. Those who remembered earlier ambitions carried them lightly now, almost apologetically. Younger generations who had grown within narrower frames did not sense absence. Their expectations matched their surroundings. This quiet adjustment ensured continuity. It reduced friction between desire and reality. It prevented constant disappointment. But it also removed certain forms of possibility before they could even be tested. No alarm sounded to mark this shift. No official recorded the exchange. It existed only in the shrinking distance between what people once envisioned and what they now considered reasonable. As identity settled into these smaller shapes, memory softened and ambition reduced. Another group emerged whose understanding of scale had never been wider. They would not experience contraction as loss, because they had no memory of expansion. And in that difference lay the beginning of the next transformations. By the time the second generation began to walk the streets alone, the occupation no longer felt like an event. For them, it was atmosphere. They didn't adjust to silence. They were born inside it. Their first memories contained permits and checkpoints the way earlier generations remembered open squares and loud debates. They learned to lower their voices not because they were warned, but because that was how everyone spoke. They saw uniforms as background fixtures, no more remarkable than street lamps or statues. Adults sometimes watched these children with a mixture of relief and quiet sorrow. Relief because they seemed untroubled. Sorrow because they did not know what had been lost. Comparison shapes dissatisfaction. Without comparison, absence goes unnoticed. A child who has never heard unguarded conversation does not feel deprived of it. A student who has always submitted forms before travelling does not imagine an alternative. Rules appear as structure rather than restriction. Authority to them felt neutral. It existed the way gravity exists. There was no sense of intrusion, only expectation. Obedience did not feel imposed, it felt orderly. The boundaries that once required adjustment were now absorbed without effort. In schoolyards, children played games that mirrored the world they knew. They organized themselves carefully, respecting invisible lines. They had never seen protests or public disputes. Calm felt natural. Parents occasionally attempted to describe earlier times, but these stories landed like distant folklore. The streets had always looked like this. The paperwork had always been required. The silence had always framed dinner conversations. This was the occupation's most complete achievement. Control no longer needed reinforcement when it was inherited. A system passed through childhood does not feel like a system at all. There was no dramatic indoctrination, no forceful rewriting of belief. The simplicity lay in repetition. When a child sees the same patterns every day, those patterns settle deeply. The unsettling realization for those who remembered otherwise was this: change might now require imagination that the young did not possess. A world never experienced is difficult to envision, and as this new generation grew taller beneath steady rules, the structures that shaped them extended further into classrooms, textbooks, and lessons designed not only to inform, but to maintain the quiet coherence of a reality they had never been taught to question. The classrooms remained bright, desks aligned neatly. Chalk dust floated in steady afternoon light. From the outside, nothing seemed altered. Children raised their hands. Teachers moved between rows. Lessons followed the calendar. What changed was quieter. History was taught with precision, but its edges were softened. Events unfolded without visible conflict. Transitions appeared orderly. Causes and consequences were described in simplified lines that left no room for lingering doubt. Complex moments were reduced to manageable summaries. They were educated carefully, so carefully that questions disappeared. Teachers did not stand at the front of the room as propagandists. They were not performers of deception. Many of them had grown into their roles gradually, adjusting the material, the way they adjusted their speech outside school. They taught what was provided, aware of what was absent, but unwilling to disrupt stability. Language itself became narrower. Words that might invite layered discussion were replaced with terms that felt neutral. Essays asked for explanation, not interpretation. Curiosity was gently redirected toward approved topics. A child who pressed too deeply into certain subjects found the conversation guided elsewhere without reprimand. Omissions proved more powerful than falsehoods. When something is excluded from a lesson entirely, it never becomes part of the mental landscape. Students do not argue with what they have not encountered. The structure of education reflected the structure of the city: orderly, efficient, incomplete. Children learned not only facts, but boundaries. They absorbed an instinct for where discussion should taper off. This shaping happened without spectacle. There were no loud corrections, no dramatic silencing of dissent. Instead, there was quiet continuity. Each year repeated patterns established the year before. Graduates moved forward with tidy knowledge comfortable in its coherence. Gaps did not trouble them, because gaps were invisible. The subtlety of this process carried its own weight. Children were not instructed directly in what to believe. They were taught, gradually, what not to explore. Caution became intellectual habit. Yet curiosity is not easily erased. It bends, it waits. And as these students entered adolescence, where identity seeks edges and meaning strains against constraint, the limits of this careful education would meet something far less orderly. Adolescence rarely arrives quietly. Even in the most orderly societies, it carries an energy that does not fit neatly within established lines. In this city, that energy surfaced in subtle ways, almost imperceptible at first. They felt restricted, but couldn't explain from what. Teenagers lingered longer, in groups than necessary. They spoke slightly louder than their parents preferred. They stayed out past agreed hours, not to make a statement, but to test a boundary they could not clearly see. Their restlessness was instinctive rather than ideological. No manifestos were written, no slogans painted on walls. Instead, there were small gestures of friction, a joke told too boldly, a song sung with unexpected intensity, a deliberate delay in following instructions. These acts did not aim at authority. They pushed against something internal. The young had grown inside a stable structure they did not remember before. Yet adolescence awakens a sense of contrast, even without historical reference. It is a stage that seeks distance from parents, from routines, from quiet expectations. Some of their rule-breaking appeared trivial, skipping classes without cause, gathering in areas slightly beyond permitted zones, speaking in coded humor that adults struggled to interpret. Often their defiance lacked direction. It did not build toward organized resistance. It scattered. The older generation watched with concern, not because these actions threatened immediate upheaval, but because they signaled strain. A system that depends on predictability relies on inherited compliance. When the young grow curious about invisible edges, stability feels less certain. The rebellion remained inconsistent. One day a teenager would challenge a rule, the next day he would follow it precisely. Their frustration surfaced without clear language. They could not articulate what constrained them because they had never known alternative frameworks. Still, these small disturbances mattered. They indicated that even a carefully normalized environment cannot erase human impulse entirely. Containment may be learned, but it is never perfect. The city continued functioning. Schools operated. Families maintained routines. Yet, beneath these patterns, a faint instability stirred, not through ideology or political awakening, but through the natural emergence of identity seeking room to stretch. And as this restless energy flickered in classrooms and street corners, older adults recognized something they could not fully describe. In the impatience of youth, they sensed echoes of what had once been larger in themselves, and that recognition carried both hope and fear in equal measure. In the evenings, parents sometimes watched their children from across the table and felt something difficult to name. The laughter was real. The conversations, though careful, carried genuine ease. There was no visible distress in the young faces leaning over homework or leaning back in boredom, and that, strangely, was what unsettled them. The most painful loss was knowing it wouldn't be remembered. The children did not mourn what had been replaced. They did not ask why certain freedoms were once ordinary. They did not notice that the city had once sounded louder, brighter, less measured. Their sense of reality contained no missing pieces. Adults carried two timelines inside them. One was the present, structured and stable. The other was faint but persistent, echoing with comparisons no longer spoken aloud. They understood that memory cannot be passed whole from one generation to the next. It arrives diluted, shaped by context. Stories told at bedtime could preserve fragments, but fragments fade without reinforcement. A child hearing about a different past treats it like legend, not loss. Over time, the urgency behind those stories weakens. Silence, too, has continuity. What was once imposed becomes customary. What was once cautious becomes polite. The absence of protest begins to resemble agreement. Parents realized that even if the occupation ended one day, their children would not feel the same shift. They would not recognize restoration as return. They would perceive it as change, perhaps even inconvenience. This recognition did not breed anger toward the young, it carried a quiet grief instead. The sense of being the last guardians of a memory that would soon belong only to themselves. The occupation had outlived open resistance. It had outlasted fear's intensity. Now it touched something deeper, continuity. It no longer needed to assert itself daily. It had woven into routine, into language, into expectation. Adults sat in stillness after their children went to sleep, listening to a city that felt calm, almost permanent. The unrest of youth flickered, but the foundations seemed stable. Yet stability can disguise fragility. Systems that extend across generations appear immovable, until they begin to strain from within. And as the older generation adjusted to the reality of fading comparison, a different kind of pressure quietly gathered, not from memory this time, but from the system itself, beginning to show small, almost imperceptible cracks. The first signs of change did not resemble resistance. They looked like clerical mistakes. A permit approved on Monday was questioned on Thursday. A travel document stamped twice was declared incomplete. One office confirmed an instruction that another quietly contradicted. None of these incidents caused alarm. They were small, isolated, easily explained. The rules still existed. They just didn't always agree anymore. For years, the system had functioned with measured precision. It did not need to shout because it rarely faltered. Boundaries were predictable. Denials followed patterns. Approval, when granted, carried confidence. Now, certainty began to blur at the edges. People encountered these inconsistencies one at a time. A worker received authorization to move departments, only to be reassigned back without explanation. A merchant was told a shipment was permitted, then delayed indefinitely. No one apologized, no one clarified. The paperwork simply adjusted. These were not dramatic breakdowns. They were symptoms of strain. A system built to monitor, record, regulate, and remember indefinitely had grown dense with its own processes. Layers of oversight overlapped. Instructions multiplied. Efficiency thinned. The city sensed the shift instinctively. Conversations did not celebrate it. No one interpreted these contradictions as liberation. Instead, they introduced uncertainty where predictability once stood. Authority still commanded. Uniforms remained in place. Files continued to accumulate. Yet the tone had altered subtly. Decisions felt procedural rather than decisive. Power seemed filtered through layers rather than directed cleanly. Where once obedience guaranteed consistency, now compliance carried risk of reversal. A person who followed instructions precisely could still find those instructions changed without warning. The edges of the system no longer aligned perfectly with themselves. The machine still ran, but it made noise now. These small errors unsettled more than outright repression ever had. Repression, at least, was clear. It defined limits sharply. Inconsistency blurred them. Citizens did not speak openly about this change. They observed, they adjusted quietly. Yet beneath daily routines, a new awareness stirred. The structure governing their lives was not flawless. It had weight, complexity, and now friction. The silence that had once felt smooth acquired faint irregularities, like cracks in glass that only caught light at certain angles. As these contradictions accumulated, something else began forming. Not rebellion, not relief, but a cautious recognition that the system's certainty could no longer be assumed. And in that recognition lay a subtle shift toward unpredictability. For years, fear had defined the atmosphere. It was sharp, unpleasant, but structured. A person understood what would attract attention and what would not. The boundaries were restrictive, yet they were visible. Now, the boundaries blurred. A recommendation letter could invite suspicion instead of approval. An instruction followed exactly might later be questioned as misinterpreted. The rules remained on paper, but their application shifted from moment to moment. When obedience stopped guaranteeing safety, people hesitated again. This hesitation did not resemble defiance. It looked like uncertainty. Workers paused before submitting documents, rereading forms not to correct errors, but to anticipate unseen complications. Merchants delayed orders, unsure whether policies might change before shipments arrived. Families postponed plans that once would have proceeded carefully, but confidently. Fear had once streamlined behavior. It dictated clear avoidance. Confusion, however, disrupted calculation. If consequences vary unpredictably, obedience loses its stabilizing power. A system designed to regulate movement through clear expectations now produced doubt instead. The emotional climate shifted quietly. The city was no less controlled, but it felt less navigable. Anxiety replaced vigilance. People found themselves second-guessing decisions that would previously have felt obvious. Authority still issued directives, yet contradictions weakened their authority's tone. A regulation emphasized one week vanished the next. Guidelines revised without explanation eroded trust in procedure. Total control depends on consistency. When directives align smoothly, compliance becomes reflex. But when they conflict, even loyal adherence fractures. This fracture was subtle. No banners rose. No sudden gathering formed in the square. Instead, there was delay. Slowed reactions. Slight withdrawal from initiative. It was safer not to move quickly in an unstable environment. Confusion introduced a new risk, miscalculation. A wrong step no longer resulted from disobedience, but from misunderstanding. And misunderstanding became easier when policies overlapped and shifted. The city adjusted again, though with less confidence. The old strategies of invisibility and caution felt less reliable. When predictability dissolves, invisibility can still be noticed. When rules contradict, neutrality loses clarity. Hesitation spread quietly through offices, homes, and markets. It did not weaken control immediately, but it altered its texture. And as uncertainty deepened, the response from those in power did not come in explanation or reform. It came in something more familiar, something heavier, tightening. When systems feel strain, they rarely pause to reflect. They reach for what once worked. Surveillance intensified quietly at first. More frequent document checks. Additional signatures required. Offices that had operated with mild efficiency began requesting secondary approvals for routine matters. The paperwork multiplied, as if the act of recording could compensate for the fading clarity beneath it. They tightened the system, but forgot why it had worked before. Permissions took longer. Renewals stalled without explanation. Minor infractions resulted in disproportionate reprimands. A missed stamp became cause for extended questioning. A small error in wording delayed an application for weeks. The purpose behind these measures remained unclear, even to those enforcing them. The city felt the pressure rising, though no public crisis had been declared. The response carried urgency without direction. Procedures grew rigid, not because new strategy had been designed, but because familiar mechanisms were being pushed harder. Fear returned, but it felt different. Earlier, fear had been sharp and decisive. It told people exactly where not to step. Now it mixed with frustration. Doubt crept in alongside caution. Citizens sensed imbalance. Control that once appeared precise, now appeared loud. The elegance of quiet compliance had been replaced by visible strain. Where silence once governed smoothly, force began surfacing more openly. Officials reasserted authority through repetition. More forms, more inspections, more visible reminders. Yet this visibility did not restore confidence. It exposed vulnerability. The structural imbalance deepened. Applying pressure without coherence does not strengthen foundations. It reveals cracks. Each additional regulation confirmed that something required correction, even if no one admitted it aloud. People responded cautiously, not with revolt, but with observation. They felt the change in tone. The system that once seemed stable now felt reactive. Some clung more tightly to predictability, avoiding unnecessary action altogether. Others grew quietly irritated, not bold enough to challenge, yet increasingly aware of inconsistency. The tightening failed to recreate the earlier equilibrium. Instead, it magnified the difference between past precision and present strain. Power remained intact, but its methods felt heavier, less subtle, more urgent. And as the effort to regain control intensified, civilians began interpreting these shifts not only as inconvenience, but as signals. The system's reaction spoke volumes about its internal condition. The city, trained for years to anticipate boundaries, now anticipated instability. And in that anticipation, perception began to shift once again, not toward defiance, but toward awareness. Comparison had been dangerous once. It sharpened dissatisfaction. It invited questions that were safer left unasked. For years, most people had avoided measuring present life against earlier days. Memory had softened. Expectation had narrowed. Stability, even constrained, had felt preferable to uncertainty. Now, without deliberate intent, comparison returned. For the first time in years, the present felt different from yesterday. It was not nostalgia that resurfaced. It was contrast. People noticed the tone of new directives, the length of delays, the way officials spoke with less assurance. These details were small, but they stood out against the smoothness of earlier routine. Conversations remained cautious. No one stood in the square declaring change. Yet within homes and offices, brief remarks slipped through. It wasn't like this before. The sentence might trail off, unfinished. It did not need completion. Recognition does not require celebration. It simply requires perception. The system still held power. Surveillance remained in place. Permits were still required, but something intangible had shifted. The machine no longer felt seamless. Its adjustments carried noise. Adults who had once stopped speaking of earlier times now revisited them quietly. Not as longing, but as reference. They remembered how efficient approvals once seemed. How consistent rules had felt. Even restriction, when stable, offered clarity. This was not awakening. No ideological revival surged through classrooms or cafes. Instead, awareness sharpened incrementally. Comparison weakens inevitability. When the present no longer feels fixed, imagination reopens. Just slightly. A person who recognizes change can also recognize fragility. The most stable systems depend less on force than on perceived permanence. When citizens believe boundaries are immovable, obedience flows naturally. When those boundaries begin shifting unpredictably, obedience requires reconsideration. Control does not collapse when people rebel. It weakens when people notice. The city did not erupt. It observed. It measured. It stored impressions quietly. And as comparison seeped back into daily thought, the instability that had been subtle began influencing choices more directly. The cracks were no longer confined to paperwork or tone. They reached into markets, schedules, and conversations, altering how people moved within a system that no longer felt entirely certain. The change did not begin with shouting. It began with slightly longer pauses between sentences. In cafes, conversations lingered a few seconds beyond what had once felt safe. A complaint about delayed permits was voiced more directly, though still quietly. A shopkeeper muttered about inconsistent regulations without immediately correcting himself. These sounds did not carry far, yet they travelled farther than before. The city wasn't loud, it was just no longer completely quiet. For years, silence had performed an essential function. It absorbed tension before it formed into speech. It softened criticism into neutrality. It kept conversations efficient and contained. Now, silence struggled to hold everything. A tram halted unexpectedly, and passengers exchanged looks that lasted just a moment too long. A document was rejected without explanation, and the applicant asked for clarification, instead of simply nodding. These were small gestures, easily dismissed, but they accumulated. Noise, in this sense, did not resemble protest. It resembled friction. Questions resurfaced cautiously. Not political questions, not bold ones, practical inquiries that implied confusion. Why has this changed? Who made this decision? The answers, when provided, often lacked precision, and that imprecision echoed. Systems designed for total quiet depend on smooth surfaces. Gradual strain introduces irregularities that no amount of caution can erase. People began articulating minor frustrations, not because they sought confrontation, but because silence no longer provided relief. The sounds were subtle, an exhale of impatience, a measured remark, an unfinished sentence that refused to dissolve entirely. Each on its own seemed harmless. Together, they shifted the atmosphere. The turning point was not dramatic. There was no single moment marking transformation. Instead, the city felt different in tone. Noise did not overwhelm order. It coexisted with it. This coexistence unsettled more than open defiance ever could. Silence had once guaranteed predictability. Now it competed with murmurs that refused complete suppression. Those in power noticed, even if they did not acknowledge it openly. Authority relies on quiet compliance. When compliance acquires texture, questions, hesitations, comments, control must adapt. The city continued functioning. Markets opened. Schools remained orderly. Yet beneath routines, sound gathered in layers. And as these layers thickened, the response would not come from the streets first. It would emerge from the top, where leadership must decide how to react when silence, once dependable, begins to fracture from within. The announcements continued. Notices were posted. Circulars distributed. Directives stamped and filed. On the surface, little appeared different. Authority still spoke in formal language. It still instructed. It still expected compliance. But something in the tone shifted. They still issued orders, but they no longer sounded certain. Where explanations had once felt precise, they now felt abbreviated. Clarifications were offered less readily. When questioned, carefully, politely, officials responded with phrases that circled rather than defined. Under review, pending adjustment, awaiting confirmation. The words filled space without resolving it. This was not incompetence. The system was not collapsing. It was overloaded. Layers of procedure, oversight, and surveillance had accumulated over years. Each adjustment, each tightening, each additional safeguard added weight. Decisions slowed because their consequences multiplied. Authority, long sustained by predictability, struggled to manage ambiguity. It could regulate movement, it could monitor speech, but adapting to evolving uncertainty demanded flexibility the structure had never encouraged. Offices hummed with activity, yet clarity thinned. Orders were occasionally reversed. Deadlines extended, then shortened. Expectations shifted quietly without acknowledgement. Those enforcing regulations often appeared as perplexed as those following them. The subtle inversion became visible. For years, civilians had recalibrated themselves to fit power's contours. Now, power began adjusting to instability, attempting to contain variations it had not anticipated. This adjustment did not announce weakness. It appeared procedural. Yet perception altered quietly. A system that revises itself too frequently reveals strain. Authority still commanded respect, uniforms still occupied intersections. But confidence, once unspoken and firm, felt measured. Citizens noticed without commenting openly. The shift was felt in tone, in delay, in the quality of response. Where once answers closed conversation, now they prolonged it. Institutional fatigue rarely declares itself. It emerges through cautious phrasing and incremental reversals. It becomes evident when structure seems to react rather than direct. And as this strain filtered outward from offices and ministries, the response among civilians did not resemble uprising, it resembled adjustment. A recalculation of risk in an environment where certainty no longer flowed reliably from above. Change did not arrive as courage, it arrived as recalculation. For years, the safest choice had been restraint. Speak less, move carefully, avoid notice. Those instincts had been learned thoroughly. They had shaped posture, conversation, ambition. But now the environment felt altered and instinct began adjusting with it. They hadn't become braver. The rules had become less clear. A man who once kept silent about a delayed shipment now asked a second question when the explanation felt incomplete. A clerk who previously accepted contradictory instructions without comment requested clarification, politely but persistently. A small group lingered in conversation after work, no longer dispersing at the first hint of uncertainty. These were not coordinated acts. They carried no shared strategy. Each decision was personal, emerging from observation rather than ideology. When compliance no longer guaranteed safety, caution lost some of its advantage. If consequences could vary unpredictably, then absolute silence seemed less essential. People began testing boundaries the way one tests thin ice, carefully, step by step. A remark extended slightly beyond safe topics. A request repeated. A minor complaint allowed to remain unsoftened. The same instincts that had once learned to withdraw now learned to assess ambiguity. Adaptation, it turned out, cuts both ways. A population trained to anticipate restriction can also anticipate weakness. Presence returned incrementally, not bold, not loud, simply measurable. Shops displayed small signs expressing frustration about supply delays. Workers negotiated shifts more openly. Parents spoke to teachers with questions rather than automatic agreement. None of this amounted to rebellion. It was behavioral symmetry. The city felt the shift in tone. Hesitation was replaced by cautious initiative. Where once people retreated at the first sign of doubt, now they held their position a moment longer. This recalibration did not dismantle control. It altered interaction. Authority still governed. Permits were still required. Surveillance continued. Yet, response patterns were no longer uniform. Psychological adaptation rarely announces itself. It spreads quietly through observation. When citizens sense instability, they adjust. They take slightly more space. Over time, these small extensions accumulated, and beneath them, something else stirred. Years of suppression, silence, and emotional conservation had stored more than caution. They had stored feeling. As people relearned risk and reclaimed slivers of presence, the emotional weight long contained began pressing forward. No longer confined neatly beneath the surface. For years, restraint had layered itself carefully across the city. Every paused sentence, every redirected question, every measured gesture had settled into place like sediment. Nothing erupted, nothing spilled over. It appeared disciplined, but compression is not disappearance. The signs were quiet, sleep became uneven. People woke before dawn without knowing why. Conversations that once ended politely began to carry sharp edges. Irritation flared unexpectedly over minor inconveniences. A delayed document triggered a reaction more intense than the delay justified. Nothing had broken yet, but everything was under strain. Some spoke with unusual candor, as if the effort of filtering had grown too heavy. A remark that once would have dissolved now lingered. A frustration voiced without immediate retreat surprised even the speaker. These moments did not form movements. They flickered, scattered, unpredictable. The body often recognizes what the mind denies. Restlessness crept into posture. Shoulders tightened. Eyes lingered longer. The weight accumulated over seasons, and years had no natural outlet. Silence had absorbed tension with remarkable efficiency. It had prevented open conflict. It had preserved order. But silence cannot metabolize everything indefinitely. Energy unspent does not vanish. It redistributes. Families felt it first. Arguments stretched further than intended. Apologies felt incomplete. Even affection carried a brittle undertone. In workplaces, patience thinned. Minor miscommunications escalated into visible frustration. People who once adjusted reflexively began holding their ground a second too long. None of this resembled revolution. There were no organized calls to action. No speeches rising above the city's rooftops. Instead, there was saturation. Pressure seeks equilibrium. Authority sensed the shift but could not define it. Regulations remained intact. Surveillance continued. Yet the atmosphere felt denser, like air before a storm that has not yet broken. The city stood suspended between containment and release. Years of adaptation had succeeded in preserving structure, but preservation had required compression. What comes next would not be a simple return to earlier patterns. Silence had done all it could. The strain did not promise dramatic upheaval. It promised inevitability. And as the weight of stored emotion pressed closer to the surface, it prepared the ground for a change that would not necessarily look like revolution, but would alter the balance in ways that could not be quietly reversed. No proclamation marked the shift. No official voice declared that something fundamental had changed. If anyone searched later for a precise day, they would struggle to find it. It didn't end in a moment. It loosened. The difference was subtle at first. An order that might once have been enforced immediately lingered without follow-up. A directive announced with routine firmness lacked repetition. A supervisor, when confronted with delay, responded with hesitation instead of discipline. The machinery continued running. Permits were still processed. Uniforms still appeared. Yet the rhythm had altered. The edge of urgency dulled. Civilians felt it without speaking. The long practice of anticipation began faltering. A man crossed a street without waiting for an unspoken cue. A woman extended her conversation beyond the point she would once have withdrawn. No one intervened. The absence of reaction unsettled more than a crackdown would have. For years, constraint had been consistent. Obedience carried a tangible effect. Now, obedience met occasional indifference. Instructions felt lighter, less anchored. The city did not erupt in celebration. No crowds gathered. Instead, a collective exhale passed quietly through markets, schools, workplaces. Release after prolonged suppression rarely arrives dramatically. It confuses before it comforts. People who had internalized caution struggled to measure this new atmosphere. Old habits persisted. Voices remained low even when no correction followed. Eyes still scanned reflexively. Silence lingered out of memory, not necessity. Authority had not vanished. It had thinned. The end of occupation, if it could be called that, did not resemble defeat or surrender. It resembled diffusion. A gradual weakening of inevitability. Power loses effectiveness. Not when it physically withdraws, but when obedience ceases to feel automatic. When compliance becomes optional in practice, even if not declared so, the structure still stood, but its grip slackened. Citizens sensed the change in increments. They tested small freedoms and met no immediate resistance. Some withdrew cautiously, uncertain if response would arrive later. Others held their position a fraction longer. This was not revolution, it was recalibration. And as the structure loosened, instincts lagged behind. People who had learned to survive within rigid limits now faced something unfamiliar: open space. The next challenge would not be overthrowing authority. It would be navigating the absence of clear boundaries, without losing balance. When the grip loosened, the space it left behind did not immediately fill with celebration. It filled with hesitation. They had wanted freedom for years. Now they didn't know how to use it. A man spoke openly in a shop, offering an opinion he once would have swallowed. The words landed in the air and remained there. No correction followed. No official entered to question him. The absence of consequence felt stranger than punishment would have. In a cafe, a group lingered past dusk, voices rising slightly with each exchange. They glanced toward the door out of habit. No interruption came. The room felt larger than before. Disagreement, once softened for safety, surfaced more directly between colleagues. A teacher questioned a policy aloud during a meeting. The room grew still, not because the question was forbidden, but because it was unfamiliar. Years of conditioning do not dissolve at the speed of circumstance. People had learned to survive within defined limits. They knew where to step and where to pause. Remove the limits, and instinct falters. Freedom, unpracticed, unsettles. The city found itself navigating choices that once required little thought. A musician debated playing a song that had long remained silent. A parent considered telling a fuller version of a story. Each decision carried uncertainty, not because it was prohibited, but because there was no clear guidance. Certainty, even restrictive certainty, offers structure. Without it, space expands in unpredictable ways. Some withdrew reflexively, unsure how far permission extended. Others tested boundaries more eagerly, only to discover that internal hesitation lingered even when external authority receded. The system had trained survival. It had not trained autonomy. Markets felt noisier, though not yet jubilant. Conversations stretched awkwardly into openness. Questions were asked with cautious confidence, as if language needed to relearn its reach. There was relief, but it arrived unevenly. For some, it felt exhilarating. For others, it felt destabilizing. When long-held structures dissolve, identity must reorganize. Freedom revealed its own demands. It required initiative, responsibility, imagination, all muscles that had atrophied under prolonged constraint. And as the city adjusted to this unfamiliar openness, the next wave emerged not from policy or politics, but from feeling. Years of compressed emotion began to rise differently now that space had widened. The aftermath would not unfold as order restored. It would surface as something more human and far less predictable. When silence loosened its hold, it did not vanish quietly. It shifted, making room for what had been waiting beneath it. What had been buried didn't come back quietly. For some, words arrived in torrents. They spoke of missed opportunities, of decisions made under pressure, of things they had swallowed for years. Conversations stretched into the night, filled with urgency. Stories poured out unevenly, sometimes repeating, sometimes contradicting themselves. It was not order they were seeking, but release. Others moved in the opposite direction. Faced with the widening space of freedom, they retreated inward. The return of choice felt overwhelming. Habit pulled them toward quiet rooms and measured speech. The absence of enforced silence did not automatically restore comfort with sound. Anger surfaced unexpectedly, not always directed at authority, sometimes aimed at neighbors, family, even at oneself. Why did we accept so much? Why did we adjust so quickly? These questions carried more heat than clarity. Relief arrived alongside grief. The city recognized that something oppressive had thinned, yet it also recognized how much had changed in the meantime. Years had passed. Opportunities had closed. Youth had matured into middle age within constraint. Emotion compressed for so long did not rise in neat categories. Joy collided with regret. Confidence brushed against doubt. Some laughed too loudly. Others wept without clear explanation. The rhythm of feeling had been distorted by survival. Recovery had no timetable. Silence does not eliminate emotion. It stores it, shaping it in confined spaces. When the container loosens, the contents spill according to their own logic. There were no parades of clarity, no tidy reconciliation. Release unfolded unevenly, human in its messiness. People forgave and resented in the same breath. They expressed gratitude and blame without resolving either. This unpredictability unsettled those who had hoped for a clean transition. Yet it revealed something essential. What had been endured had mattered deeply. The city learned that freedom does not rewind time. It exposes what time has done. Gradually, intensity softened. Conversations grew less urgent, reactions less sharp. Emotional waves settled into quieter patterns. And as this uneven aftermath found its level, another realization began to emerge. Not about what had ended, but about what would remain unchanged. The occupation had loosened, but its imprint had not disappeared. Some alterations were not emotional, they were permanent. Freedom altered the tone of the city, but it did not reverse it. Markets felt louder. Conversations carried more ease. Papers no longer required the same rigid chain of approvals. Yet certain gestures persisted. People still glanced over their shoulders out of habit. Voices occasionally lowered without reason. Doors closed more softly than necessary. They gained something back, but not everything returned. Time had continued moving beneath the weight of occupation. Children had grown. Careers had shaped themselves within limits. Friendships had thinned or fractured. Those changes could not simply be undone. Ambitions that once stretched outward did not always revive. Some individuals rediscovered their voice eagerly. Others found that the part of themselves which once desired more had settled permanently into practicality. Silence, though no longer enforced, lingered in pockets of the city. Certain topics remained untouched out of habit rather than fear. Old reflexes surfaced during tense moments, even when no authority watched. Irreversibility does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself gradually. Freedom restored space. It did not restore innocence. For some, this realization arrived gently. For others, it cut sharply. The occupation had not paused life, it had redirected it. Years lived under constraint had shaped decisions, relationships, and self-perception. The city was freer. It was not the same. Streets carried memories even when no one spoke of them. Buildings that once housed surveillance offices now served new purposes. Yet their walls retained weight. Endings rarely return beginnings. They offer continuation in altered form. This awareness did not diminish relief. It grounded it. Citizens navigated their renewed autonomy with realism. They reclaimed what they could: conversation, initiative, expression. They accepted what could not be recovered: time, certain possibilities, certain versions of themselves. No dramatic conclusion sealed this chapter. There was no moment when everyone agreed that balance had been restored. Instead, there was continuity. Life moved forward with greater openness, yet with an awareness that history remains present, even when its structures dissolve. And as the city adapted to this incomplete restoration, the story began to shift focus, from events and policies to meaning, from what happened to what endures. Change had occurred. But understanding it would require stepping further back, beyond daily adjustments, toward the deeper imprint silence leaves behind. The banners were gone, the extra checkpoints dismantled. The permits that once defined movement lost their urgency. On paper, the occupation belonged to the past. Yet mornings still unfolded with careful gestures. People rose early, prepared for work, stepped into streets that looked more open than before. Shops displayed items without as much regulation. Conversations flowed more freely. But beneath these shifts lay patterns shaped by years of constraint. Even after it ended, the silence knew where to live. A man hesitated before speaking candidly, then caught himself and continued. A woman instinctively lowered her voice, even though no uniform waited at the door. Friends met openly, yet still glanced once toward windows as if expecting interruption. These habits no longer served survival. They lingered because they had been practiced deeply. Adaptation, once necessary, had become ingrained. Posture had adjusted. Tone had softened. Even the way people listened carried a memory of caution. The occupation had altered behavior so thoroughly that freedom alone could not erase it. History does not survive only in documents and dates. It persists in reflex. Parents corrected children with gentleness that masked former anxiety. Teachers invited discussion, yet sometimes redirected it instinctively. Workers accepted authority without questioning, even when questioning was permitted. No one enforced these behaviors anymore. They endured as muscle memory. The city moved forward, but its rhythm retained traces of earlier years. Calm felt safer than exuberance. Order felt preferable to chaos, even when chaos promised possibility. Some citizens consciously worked to unlearn these instincts. They raised their voices deliberately. They encouraged bold expression in younger generations. Others saw no need. The caution felt familiar, even comfortable. Adaptation proved permanent in ways no one had anticipated. The system dissolved, but the habits it cultivated remained embedded in daily life. This persistence did not signal weakness. It signaled endurance. The occupation had been a condition. Living after it required adjusting to its absence without pretending it had never existed. And as behavior carried these quiet remnants into the present, another question surfaced, less about routine and more about recollection. How would the city remember what had happened? Would the story settle into clarity or fragment into selective silence once more? With the system loosened and daily life steadied, attention turned not only to the future but to the past. What had happened was no longer dangerous to discuss in the same way. It was possible to speak openly, yet not everyone did. When silence is no longer required, some still choose it. In cafes and homes, stories emerged gradually. Some recounted the early days in careful detail. The morning radios fell silent. The first columns of soldiers, the subtle shifts in speech. Others focused on practical memories, the ration lines, the paperwork, the constant recalibration. Their accounts carried vivid fragments, assembled according to personal experience. But alongside these voices were those who declined to narrate. They changed the subject. They shrugged. They insisted that survival had been ordinary, that nothing particularly dramatic had occurred. Not because they denied what had happened, but because revisiting it felt unnecessary or burdensome. Memory after survival does not arrange itself neatly. It fractures. Two neighbours might describe the same period with striking differences. One remembered oppression in sharp detail. The other recalled only routine. One spoke of internal resistance, the other dismissed such language as exaggeration. Neither was entirely wrong. History did not settle, simply because the authority that shaped it had weakened. The end of control did not produce a single version of truth. Narrative ownership dispersed. Some sought to document events formally, collecting testimonies and preserving records. Others resisted formalization, fearing that reducing lived experience to official account would distort its texture. Silence, once enforced, now became selective. It carried its own power. Choosing not to speak shaped collective memory as surely as any speech delivered publicly. Children, now older, listened with curiosity, but also distance. The occupation belonged to a time they had only partly understood. They absorbed stories differently than those who had endured the sharpest moments. As versions multiplied, clarity grew elusive. The city contained overlapping recollections, some loud, some muted, some contradictory. The question became less about what happened, and more about what would endure. Memory, like behavior, adapts. It simplifies. It fades. It rearranges itself according to present needs. And as these diverging narratives settled into coexistence, another possibility began to surface quietly. What happens when even contested memory begins to thin? When the urgency behind these stories dissolves into something softer and more distant? There is a way to measure occupation that does not rely on dates or documents. It is not found in treaties or withdrawals. It lives in something quieter. It didn't end when control left. It ended when silence stopped protecting anyone. For years, silence had functioned as defense. It guarded families. It softened risk. It shaped behavior into manageable patterns. Even when the system loosened, silence lingered because it still felt useful. But slowly, its purpose faded. One day, a conversation unfolded openly without reflexive caution. No one lowered their voice afterward. No one scanned the room for consequence. The instinct to protect through quiet simply did not activate. Memory shifted at the same pace. What had once felt immediate, raw and present, began receding into narrative. The tension inside recollection softened. Stories were told without urgency, then less often, then only when prompted. This was the deeper ending. Occupation succeeds not because it is loud, but because it is patient. It reshapes habits over time, weaving itself into daily motion until it feels inevitable. And it dissolves not through dramatic uprising, but through limitation. The system strained under its own weight. The people strained under years of adaptation. Eventually, both reached capacity. Survival had required adjustment, compromise, endurance. It demanded smaller ambitions and selective memory. It cultivated invisibility and caution. When the need for those tools evaporated, not suddenly but gradually, the occupation's final hold loosened with them. Control does not persist when the behaviors it depends on no longer feel necessary. When silence ceases to guard anything real, it becomes background noise. In that moment, unmarked, unnoticed by history books, the occupation ended. Not because every memory disappeared, not because every scar healed, but because the reflex to protect oneself from unseen authority no longer shaped daily life. The city did not celebrate this realization. It absorbed it. Survival, once defined by careful navigation within constraint, took on new meaning. It was no longer about endurance alone. It became about recognizing that adaptation has limits. And as this understanding settled, the narrative itself began to slow. There was no final lesson to extract, no clear moral to declare. Only a quiet recognition that some endings do not announce themselves. They simply fade into the ordinary rhythm of living. After the files were closed and the uniforms grew ordinary, life resumed its quiet pulse. The city no longer carried the sharp edges of occupation. It did not carry the sharp edges of release either. It simply breathed. Streets filled and emptied according to weather and work. Shops opened at familiar hours. Windows reflected passing faces without tension. The same pavement that had once echoed with boots now echoed only with routine. No one announced a new era. There was no final ceremony to mark a completed chapter. The city became landscape again. People aged. Children grew tall without remembering what had shaped their early classrooms. Parents watched those children step into adulthood with no reference to checkpoints or permits. Time moved forward in practical increments. Birthdays, retirements, repairs. History softened into rhythm. Stories remained, but they occupied smaller spaces. They surfaced during certain evenings, then faded. Sometimes a grandparent began recounting a fragment and stopped midway, unsure whether it needed finishing. Memory, once urgent, loosened its grip. Not everything that matters needs to be remembered to continue. Silence returned, but not as defense. It existed as ordinary quiet, the absence of alarm, not the presence of threat. It no longer pressed against speech, it framed it gently. The city did not transform into a symbol. It did not stand as warning or triumph. It existed as place. Life does not require dramatic resolution to move forward. It requires continuity. The occupation, the adaptation, the release, they became part of the undercurrent rather than the surface. Buildings weathered, names changed. Faces replaced one another in familiar doorways. If a visitor arrived without knowledge of what had transpired years before, nothing would reveal itself immediately. The streets would appear ordinary, the conversations unremarkable, the air neutral. That is how history often survives, not in monuments, but in the subtle shaping of routine. No final question demands answering here. No moral stands illuminated. The story loosens. The city remains. Somewhere, a child laughs, without inherited tension. Somewhere else, an older resident pauses, recognizing an echo that no one else hears. And then even that pause fades. Life continues, steady and unremarkable, carrying within it everything that once felt immense, without needing to name it.